So the first thing I think a lot of people overlook is negative space. When you're painting a subject, don't just think about the subject, think about the space around the subject and behind it. A lot of times this can help you paint the subject just as much as the subject itself. A lot of times what's gonna help you communicate a subject isn't all the details that make up the inside of the subject, it's actually the outside shape. If you try and think about what the subject would look like silhouetted and try to draw and communicate that as best as you can, it's going to help a lot. For example, with these grapes, I blocked them out very simply to begin with, and then I used the negative space to cut back into them to craft that specific silhouette form. So once I had that, I didn't need to put that much detail into the grapes themselves to communicate them. Another example is when painting trees, you can block out the tree very simply with just a flat color and then come back in with the negative space and cut back in and shape the tree to be more specific. Negative space is also going to help you a lot when it comes to drawing. Like in portraits, I use the negative space of the background a lot of times to cut back into the edge of the portrait to help me reshape it or fix any drawing mistakes. And a lot of times just looking at the negative shapes will help you get an accurate drawing. For example, when I was drawing in the foam on this beer mug, I wasn't just looking at the shape of the foam, I was looking at the negative shapes around the foam and using those to help me get an accurate drawing as well. Second thing I think people overlook a lot is composition. Now, if you specifically like painting landscapes and you really want to get good at painting landscapes, you really need to learn composition, because no matter how good you paint those trees or clouds or sky, mountain, river, whatever, there isn't a good composition, none of those things are going to matter. The composition is what's going to help the viewer's eye go through the painting and see all those good things that you painted. Now, there's a lot of things to learn with composition, but specifically for landscapes, I feel like the main thing to understand is when you're crafting a composition, try and have one main star of the painting, like one thing that you're trying to explain or present with that scene. And a lot of times, whatever this element is, it's going to take up the most space in the scene. For example, with this beach scene, there's a lot of ways I could have constructed the composition. I could have made it all about the ocean. I could have made it all about the beach and the sand. Could have made it all about the sky. But I decided to make it about the trees. When I was there taking the photo, the thing that had the biggest impact on me were the size and presence of these trees on the beach. So when I painted it, I made sure that the trees took up the most space on the canvas. If I made everything take up the same amount of space, making the ocean the same, the beach the same, the trees the same, the sky the same, it wouldn't be as interesting of a scene. So if you don't understand composition that well, I promise you it is well worth your time to study and look into it. If you don't know where to start, I highly recommend checking out Edgar Payne's book, Composition of Outdoor Painting. I've had that book for a while and I find myself going back to it again and again. And I'll put a link to where you can get it in the description of this video. All right, now sticking on composition, we're gonna move on to the third thing that I think people overlook, which is the focal point. Now looking back, I realized that I didn't really know what a focal point was for a long period of time. I fell into the trap of thinking, oh, it's the area of the painting with the most detail. And that's not the case. Most of the time, it's the area of highest contrast, meaning the point in your painting where the darkest dark and the lightest light meet, because that's going to create high contrast and the eye is going to be drawn to that. Now, in general, you don't want to have this in the center of your painting, and you also don't want to have any other areas in the painting that are as high of contrast as the focal point. Meaning if you can, try to get the only place where the lightest light and darkest dark touch to be at the focal point. For example, in this landscape here, the only area where the darkest dark and lightest light meet are here inside the shed, which makes it the focal point. Now I have other areas in the painting that are just as dark as this darkest dark or just as light as this lightest light, but none of those shapes are touching each other. Most of them are just touching midtones. So there's not an area of highest contrast. And that was very deliberate. It's not like that's the way the photo was. I had to change that. And I had to purposefully manipulate the values so that was the only area with that high of contrast. Now, also a lot of times a focal point will have harsher edges. You can see here in the focal point, I did use more crisp, hard edges than the rest of the painting. So don't overlook your focal point. Make sure you have it in the right place on your canvas, and make sure there's nothing else in the painting that is competing with it. All right, moving on to number 4, which is don't overlook trying to work inside out. What I mean when I say that is sometimes it can be very helpful to start with the focal point and kind of figure that area out first so it can help you with painting the rest of the painting. If you've seen a lot of my videos, you've heard me talking about blocking the painting out with big shapes of flat color and then progressively building smaller, more specific shapes on top. And that works. And working inside out is kind of the same thing. It's just focused in on a specific area. You know, coming back to this landscape painting, there's a lot of specific things happening in the focal point that if I figure out will help me paint the rest of the painting, especially value-wise. Because I gotta make sure that the dark shadow in this shed is the darkest value, and then these boards are the lightest value, but also I gotta make sure that the back wall of this shed in light is lighter than the shadow inside the shed, but also darker than the boards. So I have to dial in the values right to make the back wall read as being hit by sun while still being darker than the boards in front of it. And once I dial those in and figure that out, it's gonna make it easier to identify values in the rest of the painting, because I have this one little area to use as a sample or a key. All right, number 5 is don't overlook complement colors. You know, red and green, blue and orange, purple and yellow. Always be on the lookout to identify these and play them up against each other a little bit. For example, in this landscape here, I pushed these rocks on the mountains in the background a little more red. I introduced a little more burnt sienna to play off the greens in the trees that they were right next to. It's not like I looked at the photo and saw red there. I used what I knew about landscapes and atmospheric perspective to make that decision. I knew as things get further away from you, certain colors drop out. First yellows, then reds, and then you're left with blues. So a lot of times things that appear yellow and warm in the foreground will shift to red in the background. So I knew, oh, I can kind of shift these rocks a little more red. It's gonna set them in the background more, which is what I want. But also it's gonna look nice right next to these greens because green and red are complements. I do this also a lot with dirt and grass. Like I'll push the red and the dirt that's right next to grass because the grass is green. In the cityscape here, you can see I pushed the purple in the shadow of the building and the yellow on the light side of the building to enhance that purple yellow color complement scheme. This is very helpful in portraits when it comes to choosing a background color. If I see like a lot of oranges in the face, I might pick a blue. If I see kind of more reds, I might pick a green. And just having those complement colors against each other is gonna make things pop and be more interesting. So don't overlook complement colors and don't overlook dialing them up a little bit. Now, if you don't understand complement colors or you struggle with color mixing, I actually have the color mixing video for my Foundations of Oil Painting course for free. I'll put a link to where you can get that in the description of this video. All right, now number 6 is I feel like a lot of people overlook the effect and power of keeping your brush on the canvas as long as you can. I know this sounds a little weird, but what I like to do is I like to identify the shape I want to block in at whatever point of the painting I'm at, and then try and fill in that shape as simple and as efficiently as I can. And I'm thinking about the form of what I'm painting and trying to think as if I'm wrapping the paint around the subject. And at the beginning of the painting, I'm doing bigger shapes, so I'm keeping the brush on the canvas longer, opposed to the end of the painting when I'm doing smaller shapes, and I don't have to keep my brush on the canvas as long. Doing this and being so economical with your brush work, it's gonna make the brush work in your paintings look more confident. If you look back at some of the old master oil painters, it seems like they were able to paint their subject in as few brush strokes as possible. So next time you're painting, try that. Try and see how long you can keep your brush on the canvas without lifting it up. And I think you'll start to develop a better sense of the form of what you're painting and a better hand-eye connection to what you're trying to communicate. All right, number 7 is don't overlook working wet into wet paint. A lot of people just starting out in oil paints are very scared about working wet into wet paint. I get a lot of people asking me, how do I get my paint to dry faster? And I feel like they're trying to make oils behave like acrylics and watercolors. You don't want to do that. You want to lean into that. You know, this wet to wet paint, that's how you're going to get really good soft edges where you want, and how you're going to have very smooth transitions of value and color. Now, I know oil paint can be difficult and your paints can get muddy and you have difficulty controlling the paint. So try and do these 3 things if you're having trouble with controlling the paint working wet to wet. 1, try and work thin to thick. When you start your painting, use some paint thinner, keep the paint thin. Think about it as you're pushing the paint around the canvas, opposed to the end of the painting when you're applying the paint. And so as you build the painting, your paint progressively gets thicker and thicker until the end where you might be using a palette knife to lay on that thick paint. Second thing is working dark to light. It's a lot easier to lighten oil paint opposed to darkening it. So even when you're blocking out the light shapes of an object, try and make it the darkest light that you can at the beginning so you can progressively build lighter shapes on top of it, or work lighter paint into that dark paint to manipulate it and change it there on the canvas. And last, work big to small. So start with big dark shapes and progressively build smaller, lighter shapes with thicker paint. And it helps to always use a bigger brush than you think you need. There's also a saying, they say start a painting with a broom and end with a needle. All right, number 8 is something that I feel like most people don't overlook, but I sure did, which is don't overlook using the Lumas head method for drawing in portraits. So I've always kind of heard about the Lumas head method and the book and everything, but I actually didn't pick it up and look at it until this past year. And I realized this is the book that most people start out with. It's like the first thing that they get and look at when painting portraits. And I'm kind of the opposite, I guess. But I found it very helpful. Now, granted, I was going into this book having painted hundreds of portraits and already having a decent set of drawing skills going in, but I just found it very helpful to figure out the base structure of the head and just right from the beginning nail down the correct tilt, the correct angle, and all that stuff. So a short summary of the Lumas head method is, first you think about the cranium of the head as a ball with a nail going through the top, and you slice off the sides of that sphere, and then you mark off a line halfway down horizontally for the brow line, and then halfway from the brow line to that nail at the top of the head is where the hairline would be. And you take that distance and mirror it down from the brow line to get where the nose is, and then one more time to where the chin is. And you connect the jaw at the side at the bottom of the ear, which is in line with the bottom of the nose. And it's a quick way to block out the form and tilt of the head, and you can adjust those measurements depending on the person that you're painting. So if they have a shorter chin, you'd move it up, or larger forehead, increase that size. And I just found it really helpful, especially when I'm painting from life, because your model is always going to be moving a little bit, you're moving a little bit, so it helps me establish a position of the head and keep that position, and not always trying to chase what I see and changing what I see, and it just keeps me on track. And the more I use it, the more freedom I feel like I have when painting portraits. I also feel like I'm thinking and drawing and painting more in 3D opposed to 2D. I'm not just thinking about the distance from the nose to the mouth. I'm thinking about the form that's happening between the nose and the mouth. Does that make sense? Anyways, if you're trying to get better at portraits, I can't recommend that book enough. And I will, of course, put a link to where you can get that in the description of this video. All right, number 9 is I feel like I see a lot of people overlooking value as it pertains to depth in a landscape. With atmospheric perspective, one of the things that happens is as things get further away from you, the contrast in values gets less. So for example, the shadows in a set of trees in the foreground is going to be darker than a set of trees in the background. And I see a lot of people making things too dark that are supposed to be far away because that's what they're seeing in the photo. Always remember that landscape photos are very deceiving. A lot of times photos make the darks too dark and the lights too light. I see this happening a lot, especially with things that are in the distance. So you have to be able to adjust for that. All right, now we're actually gonna stick on values for this last thing that I see people overlook, which is the value planes of a landscape. You can pretty much break a landscape down into 4 major value planes. The sky is gonna be your lightest, and then your ground plane is going to be a little bit darker. And then any slanted planes like hills or mountains are going to be even a little more darker than that. And the darkest are going to be upright objects, things like trees, houses, and people. Now, see, a lot of times students will make trees too light. This can be very tricky, but don't get fooled. Even the light side of trees are darker than you think. Also see people making the ground too bright. Now, there are exceptions to this. You know, if you have snow or really light sand, it'll be lighter than the sky. But make sure to take the time to dial in the ground correctly. I feel like a lot of times it's the hardest thing to get right, because a lot of times it's just slightly darker than the sky. So it's always very helpful when you're working on a landscape to take a picture of it with your phone and then put that photo into black and white and check your values, you know, making sure you didn't make the sky too dark or the ground too light or, you know, a house too light. And again, photos can be deceiving, and these value planes might not be that apparent and obvious in a photo, but if you know this information, you can adjust and dial things in correctly. All right, that's it for this video. If you have any questions about oil painting or topics you want me to talk about, please leave a comment in the comment section below. And if you'd like to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.